Morning, everybody. Boker Tov. It's Thursday, and we are moving on to a whole new section of Jeremiah, for which I will read from the intro in the JPS Study Bible, which says as follows: Chapter 46 through chapter 51, Jeremiah's oracles concerning the nations. We talked about this a little bit last week when we asked about the placement of the previous chapter, the short chapter about Jeremiah's prophecy to his scribe, Baruch ben Neriah, and that this kind of suggested maybe a transitional chapter as we're moving away from prophecies that are internal to Judah and Jerusalem, and now outwards to prophecies to the other nations. Of course, something which is anticipated in Jeremiah chapter 1, a section we often turn back to, the kind of initiation prophecy of Jeremiah, in which God says to him in chapter 1, verse 10, "See, I appoint you this day, re'eh hifkareticha hayom hazeh, al hagoyim va'al hamamlachot," over nations and kingdoms. And the verse goes on. So Jeremiah was meant to be a prophet who spoke not only to Judah and Jerusalem, not only sometimes an appeal to the vanished northern kingdom, but actually a prophet who also spoke to or about other nations. And here's what the JPS Study Bible has to say about these oracles concerning the nations. An example of the prophetic word formula introduces the oracles concerning the nations, including Egypt in chapter 46, Philistia in chapter 47, Moab in chapter 48, the Ammonites in chapter 49, Edom also in chapter 49, Damascus also in chapter 49, Kedar and Chatzor also in chapter 49, Elam also in chapter 49, and Babylonia in chapters 50 and 51. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 nations or groups to whom or about whom these prophecies come outside of Bnei Israel, of the Israelites themselves. Similar collections of oracles concerning the nations appear in other prophetic books, including Isaiah chapters 13 to 23. So that's plopped in the middle of Isaiah, which, as we notice, this is really the end of Jeremiah. There's a couple of concluding historical sum-up chapters at the end, but basically these prophecies to the nations are at the end of Jeremiah, whereas in Isaiah it's in the middle. Ezekiel chapters 25 to 32, middle. Amos chapter 1 to 2, so that's there in the beginning. Zephaniah chapter 2, Obadiah and Nahum, which are relatively short. So putting it at the end instead of the beginning or the middle is a little bit unique to Jeremiah. The oracles concerning the nations do not address universally all the nations of the earth, but include nations selectively. For example, Isaiah includes nations that were part of the Persian Empire. Ezekiel includes nations that were attacked by the Babylonians. And Amos includes nations of the Syro, meaning Syria, Syro-Israelite region that were incorporated into the Assyrian Empire. Like Isaiah chapters 13 to 23, the oracles in Jeremiah chapters 46 to 51 include nations that were conquered by the Persian Empire beginning in 539 BCE in an effort to claim that God's judgment against Babylonia was carried out by the Persians. Okay, so this places it a little bit historically later than Jeremiah is himself based. So this is an interesting hypothesis. These oracles concern the nations, but are not addressed to the nations. Okay, so Jeremiah is not on a world tour heading off to Egypt, well, he was in Egypt, heading off to Babylonia, heading off to Philistia, heading off to Damascus. He's not going to these places, as far as we can tell, but speaking about the nations. They emphasize a point already made at the beginning of classical prophecy in Amos, that the God of Israel is a universal God who controls the destiny of all the nations of the world. In some cases, there are significant similarities between oracles against the nations recited by different prophets, suggesting that prophets or editors of prophetic books borrowed these prophecies from one another. So we have common themes across prophetic books about some of the different nations. We have some overlapping and some different choices of nations for the different prophets. Their comments are going to be about, but not really directed, not said to the different nations that they are prophesying about. And as Rabbi Alex Israel in his podcast on these chapters of Jeremiah points out, God is not preoccupied in the way the Bible, introduces us to God as a God who has a special relationship with the Jewish people and therefore holds them to a higher standard and has more exacting reward and punishment for them. And therefore, in the prophetic books, where the focus is, Judah and Israel, a lot of it has to do with our sins and the things that are going to befall us as a result of our sins and not listening to the word of the prophets. We don't really have that dimension in these prophecies about the other nations. It's not, you did the wrong thing and therefore you're being punished. It's more just a vision of God as the one who orchestrates everything. And so, we have instances of descriptions of historical events that happen to these other nations and the sense that God is behind them. And we're going to see that with Egypt in these next next chapters. So it doesn't have the moral weight that our previous chapters typically do, but it still positions God as the one who is overseeing and managing everything that's happening with the other nations. And of course, we'll see in this one, and we'll have to keep our eye out in subsequent chapters. Are the Israelites, is Judah, are the Jewish people present in these chapters or not? In other words, is God talking to and managing the other nations irrespective of the Israelites, or is there some kind of intersection with the fate of the Jewish people or with these nations as they interact with the Jewish people? We'll see that is the case in these prophecies about Egypt at the end, but not necessarily all of the other ones. Okay, so that's a little by way of introduction. Questions or comments before we dive into this long chapter? Okie dokie. Chapter 46 in the Brown JPS Tanach. We're in the middle of page 1122. We've spent the last number of weeks, the last handful of chapters in narrative. So, buckle up because we're getting back to that poetic, slightly esoteric, prophetic language. And it's a different kind of reading and listening experience. Lance, let's start with you, the word of the Lord.
Okay. The word of the Lord in the prophet Jeremiah concerning the nations, concerning Egypt, about the army of Pharaoh, I need my magnifying glass, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, which was at the river Euphrates near Carchemish, and which was defeated by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in the 4th year of King Joachim's son of Josiah of Judah. Get ready, buckler and shield, and move forward to battle. Harness the horses, mount you horsemen, fall in line, helmets on, burnish the lances. That's funny. Don your armor. Why do I see them dismayed, yielding ground? Their fighters are crushed, they flee in haste and do not turn back. Terror all around, declares the Lord. The swift cannot get away, the warrior cannot escape. In the north, by the river Euphrates, they stagger and fall. Who is this that rises like the Nile, like streams whose waters surge? It is Egypt that rises like the Nile, like streams whose waters surge. That said, I will rise, I will cover the earth, I will wipe out towns and those who dwell in them. Advance, O horses, dash madly, O chariots. Let the warriors go forth, Cush and Put, that grasp the shield, and the Ludim who grasp and draw the bow. But that day shall be for the Lord, God of hosts, a day when he exacts retribution from his foes. The sword shall devour, it shall be sated and drunk with their blood. For the Lord God of hosts is preparing a sacrifice in the northland by the river Euphrates. Go up to Gilead and get balm. Is that some famous thing? Balm in Gilead?
Yeah.
Does that come from this?
Good question. I'm not sure if it's mentioned other places.
Fair maiden Egypt, in vain do you seek many remedies. There is no healing for you. Nations have heard your shame. The earth resounds with your screams. For warrior stumbles against warrior. The two fall down together.
Okay.
Word which the Lord...
Hold on. Just pause here. Before we go on, I'm just going to read. We're going to read through the whole chapter. I'm just going to pause. I should have done it first to read to you the little JPS Bible, study Bible intro to this section. which reads as follows. Done.
Is this really Jeremiah's language?
Is it really Jeremiah's language? I mean, we haven't heard this type of language in a while, but it certainly fits with his style of previous sections. So this is what the JPS Study Bible introduces this section. Egypt was able to take control of Judah in 609 BCE, following Paro Necho's killing of King Josiah at Megiddo. Apparently, Josiah was attempting to stop the Egyptians from moving north to Haran, so that they might support the beleaguered Assyrian army against the Babylonians. Although Josiah died, Egypt was delayed long enough so that the Babylonians were able to destroy the Assyrians at Haran. The Egyptians were then left to face the Babylonians alone. Necho, that's again Paro Necho, attempted to strengthen his position by removing Josiah's son Jehoahaz from the Judean throne and replacing him with his pro-Egyptian brother Jehoiakim. Jeremiah was a constant critic of alliance with Egypt, in keeping with his Elide, meaning from the family of Eli, priestly roots, which emphasized the Exodus tradition and its portrayal of Egypt as Israel's enemy, and his associations with the pro-Babylonian elements of the royal court, such as the family of Shaphan, who served as Josiah's secretary. Okay, so just we have these tensions between prophet and king, where the king is pro-Egypt and Jeremiah is anti-Egypt, anti-Egyptian alliance, broadly speaking. When the Egyptians were defeated at Carchemish in 605, the Babylonians took control of Judah. Subsequent revolts against Babylonia, prompted by pro-Egyptian elements in the monarchy, ultimately resulted in the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile. So again, the situation here, we're around somewhere 609 to 605 is this setting. Josiah has been killed when he tried to go out and kind of intercept Paro Necho, and he should have left well alone and let the Egyptians pass through. But now the Egyptians go on to battle against the Babylonians, and in the year 605, Paro Necho is defeated by Nebuchadrezzar at Carchemish, and Babylonia takes kind of a more significant control. And so we're kind of reading about the fall of Egypt in this moment. So that's what this first section is about, and we'll come back to
Rough Stephen,
a little more closely. Yes, Lance. And
does Babylon ever control Egypt, take over Egypt?
Meaning, does Babylonia descend down to Egypt and
defeat the Egyptians and take over as they did Jerusalem?
That's a good question, which I don't know the answer to off the top of my head.
Doesn't Jeremiah predict it?
Yes, he does. He does. And I'm trying to remember if does it come true all the way down in Egypt? I just don't remember off the top of my head.
According to Professor Daniel Kahn,
thank you,
Torah.com, which is edited by Chovevi graduate Rav
Zev Farber.
Yes, Rav Farber. Professor Kahn says no, Babylon does not go into Egypt as Jeremiah prophesied.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's an odd, false prophecy, right?
Yeah, I don't. That's a great question, and I don't know enough about it. But let's see what else we can learn about. Hold on a second, Estelle. Ellen, and then Estelle. Yep, go ahead.
I don't even understand why any of this is in it.
Okay.
Here, I mean, it's got nothing to do, or it's certainly the rest of the prophecies have to do with Israel's relationship with God. This has nothing to do with Israel's relationship with God. This is just this guy, I don't know, I mean, not showing off that he also can predict the future, or he can also discuss other things, but it has no relevance. And why is it even in here?
Okay, that's a fantastic question. Remember, we got to go back to chapter 1 and ask the question there when God says to Jeremiah, "I've appointed you as a prophet to the nations," not just to the nations, of course, centrally to Judah and Jerusalem, but also to the nations. What is the function of that? What is, and again, as we said, Jeremiah is not going to these people and telling them this. So I can only surmise that in some way, this is the way of communicating to the Jewish people that God is behind everything, and therefore, you know, okay, a few things. One, therefore, see the power of this God, right? It's not just a local relationship. God is so powerful. God has power over other nations, and therefore God really, really has power over you. That's one possibility. Another possibility is, therefore, when the prophet comes and says, do have an alliance with this people, don't have an alliance with those people, these are not just political statements. It's because when the prophet says things, now again, Lance points out maybe they didn't all come true, but when the prophet says, don't cozy up to the Egyptians because they're ultimately going to be destroyed by the Babylonians, why should I believe that? I just have my relationship with my God and what my God does for me. So when you hear these other prophecies, you sense that God is pulling the strings behind all of global events, and you then take the prophecies that have to do with interaction with other nations maybe more seriously. Just one possibility. Do you want to respond? Hold on, Estelle. Hold on.
It seems almost antithetical to the idea that we are supposed to be a people with a covenant with God and act certain ways because of our relationship with God. And now all of a sudden, it's almost as if we have no agency. It doesn't matter what we do in this covenant. God's going to do what he wants to do anyway. And so there's always that pull, it takes me back to, can you then turn around and say, okay, these wars or the Holocaust are because God's angry? And then everything falls apart.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think that we have to read it exactly that way. But I appreciate the questions you're raising. Again, I would sort of just stick with the sense that this is here to give us the understanding that God is behind everything. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean, still when we come to the theology, in the Bible, there was a sense that a religious framing, that things were happening because of people's behaviors, etc. The rabbis already just problematize that and say we don't always have, God could be behind everything. It still doesn't mean that we're being punished, that everything bad that happens is a punishment for our wrongdoings. God can be more active or less active in the background. And then we still have to ask, well, why does God choose to stand idly by? This is here you get into Rav Yitzhak Greenberg, theology that God in a more modern time entrusts more power to humans and self-limits. But yeah, the complicated and important theological questions I think this is raising. Graham, hold on a second. Estella's next.
No, all I wanted to ask was the relevance of Egypt in this particular area and milieu. That's all. I mean, where does Egypt come into this in any case?
Yeah, great. So, that's you can ask an even better question as we get later on into the prophecies about the nations. What does Kedar or Elam have to do with the Israelites is even an even better question than Egypt. It is worth noting, by the way, that as you read through the oracles concerning the nations and the different prophets, especially in Isaiah and in Jeremiah and Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu, Egypt and Babylonia are the most prominent of the prophecies. And because Rabbi Silber, in a podcast on this chapter, points out that in chapters kind of 10 or 11 and 12 of Genesis, of Breshit, we have the very, very beginning of the movement towards the land of Canaan for Abraham. is preceded by the construction of Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Bavel. And then after Abraham gets to the land, the first thing he does is go down to Egypt. So you sort of have Babylonia and Egypt are the kind of framing neighbors, like on a global scale. They're kind of the framing neighbors and counter powers as we begin our journey, historically, biblically to the land of Canaan. And here at the end of the first Commonwealth, as we're being exiled, the kind of bookends are again Egypt and Babylonia. So they are important counterweights with whom we've had historic interactions. Certainly Egypt is kind of positioned, we've talked about this already in the last couple of chapters, as sort of the moral counterforce, the corrupt moral counterforce, immoral counterforce to Bnei Israel. But yes, what are the direct, international relations between them? What's the significance of this? At some level, what we're talking about in these prophecies are, the defeat of Egypt, which then moves the dominant power to be Babylonia. So there is an impact just on who Israel is having relationships with at this moment. But hold on, Ella. I want to get to I will come back to you, but a couple people who haven't commented yet are Graham and then Carl. Go ahead.
Wow. Okay, I'm trying to understand this. It's that, okay, Egypt was against Babylonia, 605 BC. They, let's see, but Egypt attacks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And God takes sides with Babylonia, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And dedicates, all his powers to defeat Egypt.
Yeah.
And then, so I came to him, why is God so interested in this?
That's my question.
Okay.
Where does God come into
Okay.
this?
I
Okay.
mean, why should we be? And it is and then on the idea of Jeremiah, is Jeremiah God's emissary but speaking for himself? Is it that the way you can give your good thoughts, your approval to someone, and they get to bask in the light of whatever reputation you've been able to put together, and then but then they speak for themselves, like, is it that God has invested his authority in Jeremiah but leaves Jeremiah free to do his own thinking? And I find it I like that, because I like to think of myself in the same way. Think of maybe think of myself as being in the same relationship with God, or all of us really. In other words, is Jeremiah on his own, but with God's blessing to say as he does, and then more generally, it makes me wonder: are these simply ways of thinking about historically how to make sense of the whims of nature, politics, history, war, prosperity? Um, are all these things seem to be happening by themselves, and with their own rhythms, their own whims. And so I could see these people in history, we today as well, because things seem to be spinning out of control in many ways. But we need some way to explain, as they did, seemingly random events.
Mm-hmm.
So in the old days, they didn't have much science, but so they would want to attribute everything to God's will.
Yeah.
Why did it happen? Why did it rain? It was God's will.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so maybe that's a function of prophecy, especially in ancient times, when rational explanations were rare, and
Yeah.
so that these myths were created to explain things in a way that simple people could understand, could say, ah, yes, I see that now. They could take that to the bank, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay. Estelle is thumbs upping that explanation, and yeah, it's I think the questions here are not better than the answers, but the questions generate interesting thoughts and answers. I don't think we will find a specific answer inside the text itself necessarily. And as I said at the outset, and I think this is part of what's sparking the reaction that we're having, the prophecies to Judah and Jerusalem are always saying, well, you did this wrong and therefore this is happening. And here it's just God kind of narrating poetry about I made all this happen, and and right, taking credit. And what's the meaning of that? So, it's, I think, Graham, you started to say it in a sense, it's presenting a theology where everything that happens is, from God, and that can either be disempowering or it can be reassuring. But I think to our ears, it's a little bit harder to totally grasp, buy into, understand its role or its importance. But I guess to come back in the other, from the other direction, just sort of ask this. It's a good question to reflect on our own theology. We don't have to have this conversation now, but to ask ourselves, what role do I see God playing? If I imagine an active God in any way, shape, or form, what role does God have? Is it different with the Jewish people than other nations? Is God interested in global geopolitical events? If so, why? If not, why not? These are good questions to ask ourselves. Carl's up next.
Okay, so the question I want to raise is certainly related to this. You might say, well, how good is God's geopolitical instincts?
Mm-hmm.
And it's very relevant today when you have rabbis, what's happening in the world and in Israel on both sides of this of whatever the crises are. How seriously should we take them? Because if you look at this, Egypt, I mean, Israel after Shlomo, Egypt attacked Israel when Shlomo passed away, and the nation split. But then I think for 400 years they really didn't bother very much with Israel. And why should you have assumed? I mean, historically, again, counterfactual, who knows what should have happened. But if Egypt had defeated the Babylonians, maybe that would have been a very good thing. I mean, Egypt left Israel alone, basically. The Babylonians and the Assyrians destroyed Israel. They destroyed Judah. And it's not clear that these were the correct geopolitical decisions to make. Because maybe Israel would have done a lot better. The Jews would have done a lot better if Egypt had been the major power and not Assyria and Babylon. So,
yeah, it's a fascinating comment. I guess, because God is the author in the framework of the Bible, God tells the story that God, in the framework that works for God, so to speak, right? So it's like, any nation which is being defeated, God is on the side of the victor. It is what it seems like. Now, I guess it's that makes it all the more painfully ironic, when the Jews are being defeated. But even there, God says things like, I've assigned Nebuchadnezzar, my servant, to come and destroy you. So it seems like, I like the question, how are God's geopolitical instincts? They didn't always work out well for Israel, but in the way the Tanach tells the story, that's always because Israel was deserving of punishment, and therefore God assigned another nation to come and destroy them. So Ruby often asks this kind of question, like, is this just a religio-historical retrofitting, onto history of God telling the story the way God wants it for, religious lessons? And the answer may be yes. It may be yes. I don't think we have any way ultimately to conclude an answer to that question. Did anyone else want to comment before we go a little further? Okay. Okay, good. I mean, these are questions we could generate on any of the coming chapters. I'm sure we will generate some of them again on subsequent chapters. And maybe that'll be the focus of our conversation more than some of the specific word by word, but we'll just take a moment to kind of notice the first half, what we read so far. We have the setting in verse 2. First, we're told Limitzrayim. This is concerning Egypt, and in particular, the army of Paro Necho. And then we get, starting in verse 3, these just dramatic depictions of, get ready to battle. And yet, people are suddenly, losing. And in verse 6, Al Yanus Hakal Va'al Yimalei Tagibor, the swift can't get away and the warrior cannot escape. If there's any theme, if there's any moral theme in these chapters, it's that, and this, comes up in Hannah's song after the birth of Shmuel, and other places, that God fells the mighty, right? Anytime people attempt to think that they are the most powerful, God will swoop in and prove that they're wrong. So if there's any wrongdoing attributed to those who are vanquished in the prophecies against the nations, it's their arrogance or their haughtiness. That's kind of a key wrongdoing amongst the nations. We saw that in Yeshayahu also, not just for the Israelites, but especially for the other nations. So the swift cannot get away. In verse 6, the warrior cannot escape. You could be the strongest, you're not strong. Well, if God deems you to be the one who will be defeated. And then we have this Egypt rising like the Nile, obviously a fitting metaphor because that's the central kind of feature biblically of Egypt. And it has this, assumption in verses 8 and 9 that it is going to be mighty and that it is going to be victorious. But in verse 10, that's going to be a day for God to exact retribution from God's foes. Yom nekama lehinakem mitzarav. The sword will devour, it'll be sated and drunk with their blood. And then we have fascinating language as to kind of religiously to think about, to, in a sense, maybe anachronistically relate to the notion of holy war. Right here we have very much a crossover between religious worship terms and battle terms. Zevach ladonai Elohim tzvaot in verse 10. God is preparing a sacrifice in the Northland by the river Euphrates, right? The notion of God preparing a sacrifice is kind of fascinating because we sacrifice to God. So what does it mean that God is preparing a sacrifice? And why doesn't just sort of say a slaughter, essentially? But we sort of somehow borrow from temple terms, cult terms for this destruction of Egypt. And then in verse 11, Lashav hirbeit refuot te'ala ein lach. It's in vain that you seek remedies. There's no healing for you. Now we have kind of just a closing that globalizes this moment. Shamu goyim kilonech. This is very much parallels the way the fall of Israel is often described, where you'll become a laughingstock amongst the nations. So nations have heard your shame, and the earth resounds with your screams. Ki gibor begibor kashalu. This is kind of the triumph of God over the human mighty, right? Warriors just kind of trip over one another. Yachdav naflu shnehem, and the two fall down together. It's kind of like, in a sense, it may be talking about Egypt, but it may be, I think, in a powerful way, maybe this is a homiletic take, but it may just be God's eye view of war, right? It's just a bunch of people fighting and they all fall down. Like maybe I'm weighted down by our current events. But sort of you look at war, you got strong, mighty people on both sides of a battle, and they kill each other and they fall down. The Yachdav naflu shnehem, both of them. Again, it could just be that this is the Egypt side that we're talking about, or maybe it's a broader comment about war. Heroes fight against heroes, in some wars, not in all wars are there heroes on both sides, but heroes fight against heroes, and in the end, it's just death on both sides. Okay, let us move to the second half. We'll round out this chapter. This second half, by the way, we almost nailed the calendrical timeline. Starting here in verse 13 is the Haftarah for Parashat Bo. This week we're reading Parashat Shmot. We're beginning our experiences from the end of Breshit also, but we're beginning our national experience in the land of Egypt. And now we have various haftarot that relate to Egypt. And 2 weeks from this Shabbat Parashat Bo, we read this haftarah. So, as we are exiting Egypt, we have this haftarah about, is taken from this chapter of Jeremiah about Egypt. And we'll see that, we come across locusts, darkness, things like that. Various things that are what one of the my friend Josh Blechner, who writes little essays on Project 929, he calls Jeremiah taking out his Egypthosaurus, right, borrowing from terms that are familiar to us biblically in our relationship to Egypt. So we are on verse 13, and Graham, will you read for us?
Okay. The word which the Lord spoke to the prophet Jeremiah about the coming of King Nebuchadrezzar of Babylon to attack the land of Egypt. Declare in Egypt, proclaim in Migdol, proclaim in Noph and Tapanis, say, take your posts and stand ready, for the sword has devoured all around you. Why are you stalwarts swept away? They did not stand firm, for the Lord thrust them down. He made many stumble. They fell over one another. They said, up, let us return to our people, to the land of our birth, because of the deadly sword. There they called Pharaoh, king of Egypt, braggart, who let the hour go by. As I live, declares the king, whose name is the Lord of hosts, as surely as Tabor is among the mountains and Carmel is by the sea, so shall this come to pass. Equip yourself for exile, fair Egypt, you who dwell secure. Sort of mocking. For Noph shall become a waste, desolate, without inhabitants. Egypt is a handsome heifer. A gadfly from the north is coming. Coming! The mercenaries, too, in her midst are like stall-fed calves. They too shall turn tail, flee as one, and make no stand. Their day of disaster is upon them, the hour of their doom. She shall rustle away like a snake. As they come marching in force, they shall come against her with axes, like hewers of wood. They shall cut down her forest, declares the Lord, though it cannot be measured, for they are more numerous than locusts and cannot be counted. Fair Egypt shall be shamed, handed over to the people of the north. The Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, has said, I will inflict punishment on Ammon of No and on Pharaoh, on Egypt, her gods and her kings, on Pharaoh and all who rely on him. I will deliver them into the hands of those who seek to kill them, into the hands of King Nebuchadrezzar of Babylon, and into the hands of his subjects. But afterward she shall be inhabited again, as in former days, declares the Lord. But you have no fear. My servant Jacob, be not dismayed, O Israel. I will deliver you from far away, your folk from their land of captivity, and Jacob again shall have calm and quiet, with none to trouble him. But you have no fear. My servant Jacob, declares the Lord, for I am with you. I will make an end of all the nations among which I have banished you. But I will not make an end of you. I will not leave you unpunished, but I will chastise you in measure.
Okay. So we have the second half, which is to my ear at least a little bit more confusing in terms of the kind of movement back and forth of the fate of Egypt here. Let me go back and share my screen again. We'll just quickly look through it. Hold on a second, Estelle. Just quickly look through. Okay, so in going back in verse 14, this is a word which the Lord said to the prophet Jeremiah about the coming of King Nebuchadrezzar of Babel to attack the land of Egypt. So that did happen in the year 601 or 600, and it seems like it was not a successful attack. And it seems, as Lance pointed out to us, that maybe there was yet another attempt of Babylonia to overcome Egypt, which was unsuccessful. And yet here it seems like there is at least some significant destruction that happens, right? So the prophecy is, tell the Egyptians to get ready. There is destruction which is coming. God made many stumble and fall. Then again, I don't know exactly what this is in the end of verse 16. Up, let us return to our people because of the deadly sword. Maybe this is just a precursor of kind of fleeing back after the Battle of Carchemish and criticizing Pharaoh for not being successful. We have this fascinating line, as surely as Tabor is among the mountains and Carmel by the sea, so shall this come to pass. Right, so God circles back to metaphors from the land of Israel, even when talking to the Egyptians. Get ready for exile. These destructions are happening. Verse 21, the day of disaster is coming, the hour of their doom. We have these various comparisons to calves. Kola kanachash yelech, she shall rustle away as a snake. That's also from the Egypt thesaurus, when Moses comes down and turns his staff into a snake. And the Egyptian sorcerers are able to do the same. But they're going to be marching against her. We kind of mix our metaphors here now into trees. They're going to chop down her forest. We get our locusts also from the plagues. And this seems like this is the Babylonia are more numerous than the locusts, and they're going to chop down the forest, which is Egypt. And Egypt is going to be shamed and handed over to the people of the north. So again, exactly when this is this still the Carchemish battle? Is this a different battle? Not totally clear, but it's a depiction of a Babylonian victory over Egypt. And as it goes on to say explicitly in verse 26, God will deliver the Egyptians into the hands of King Nebuchadrezzar and his subjects. And then we are reminded that, as many, many prophecies about the Jewish people's destruction end with a little note of hope, so to the Egyptians. Acharechen tishkon kimei kedem, ne'um Adonai. After all that, she will dwell like the days of old, says the Lord. So Egypt is going to have a restoration after its destruction, which then seems to contradict a little bit what happens in verse 27 and 28, where God says, you'll never have to, you won't have these problems, oh Israelites, oh Jacob, I'm going to deliver you and you're going to have calm and quiet. I'll make an end of all the nations among which I have banished you, but I will not make an end of you. You won't be unpunished. You'll be chastised in measure, but you won't, all the other nations will disappear and you will remain. How exactly do we read that with, what we saw 2 verses ago, that Egypt will be restored? So is this saying beyond that? Yes, Egypt will be restored, but you, Jacob, you will ultimately outlast them all. Unclear. And again, so now we get a little question. Is that the whole purpose of this chapter? To just describe to the Israelites, the rise and fall of Egypt, and that even if Egypt is restored, both Egypt and Babylonia will ultimately disappear, and the Israelites will be the ones who remain. So is it all just in service of those last 2 verses? Is it meant to teach us something particular about Egypt, about Babylonia? We don't necessarily know. I see, Estelle, did you want to comment? And then Lance, then we'll wrap up.
I was just wondering, that why, if God is controlling all this business, why is God favoring Babylonia over Egypt? And just like that,
Yeah.
could it be because he's anticipating the fact that if the Israelites stay in Babylonia, that's when they will be able to write the Babylonian
Hmm.
Torah and
Right.
all this kind of jazz.
Interesting. Interesting.
I mean, people who sort of think this way, is it possible?
Right. That's a great question. We don't know. We really don't know why God favors. Again, we can always come from the retrospective perspective and say because Babylonia defeated Egypt, so that's why God is on Babylonia's side. But it's hard to know for sure. Lance and then Ellen. We'll wrap up.
Okay. First of all, it's interesting that AI Overview could not find a specific place in Tanach or the New Testament anywhere where about the bomb in Gilead thing.
Okay.
This line, AI Overview could not find. It's interesting
Okay.
to me.
Interesting.
Second of all, I just want to make the point that there, as far as I can tell, anywhere in these ancient texts, there is no such thing as ceasefire. Do you know where there's a ceasefire in these texts?
Don't know.
And why then?
Because ceasefire with the enemy's defeat and surrender is the only way you can have victory in ancient times. Of course, that doesn't hold today. And it seems to me that a literary thing is called the upward arc. In other words, Joseph constitutes an upward arc. The movement from slavery to the promised land is an upward arc. And you could think of the Holocaust to the IDF as an upward arc.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Yes, Elaine pointed out Bomb of Gilead comes earlier. I think it's in chapter 8. So little fail on the AI side of things today. Okay, Ellen, last word.
I guess it brings up the idea of what exactly is destruction to me. I mean, the Egyptians, he keeps saying here that they're going to be obliterated or they're going to be destroyed, but they remain intact.
Mm-hmm.
And they always remain intact.
And they still are.
And they still are intact. Whereas the Jews who he says, I will keep your remnants and you will survive, have been dispersed always. So what exactly is destruction? And
It's a good question.
and what is the meaning of all of these prophecies? It seems to me that Israel, yes, it's true about Israel. They've been destroyed and there are remnants.
Yes.
And there have always been remnants. But I don't see the destruction of the others. They are intact.
It's interesting. Right.
Right.
Okay. And, yes. So we have to ask if the prophecies ring true for us. Are maybe that's still yet in a future time that the other empires will ultimately fully disappear. Right. We heard, yes. Was it supposed to be then? Yeah. 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 All right. Sorry for a quick end, but I have to run out to a lunch. So great to see everybody. Great to see mom and dad. Love and Shabbat Shalom to all, and look forward to continuing next week as we launch into our international relations geopolitical section of Jeremiah. Good day to all.
Thank you.
Great question.